The morning Louise Boone discovered the tax notice nailed to her front door. The wind was blowing so cold off the Upsaroka range that the paper shook like a frightened animal in her hands, and she could not tell if it was the cold or the fear that made her fingers tremble. It was the autumn of 1878, and Louise was 26 years old, which was not so young anymore. Not in the Montana Territory, where the land aged a person faster than anywhere else on Earth. She had been running the Boone homestead alone for 8 months, ever since her father, Clarence Boone, had died of a fever in March, leaving her with 160 acres of rough valley ground, a half-finished barn, 12 head of cattle, and debts she had not known existed until the lawyers started arriving with their leather satchels and their sympathetic eyes that were not sympathetic at all. The tax notice was not a surprise, exactly. She had known the property taxes were due. What surprised her was the number written in neat black ink at the bottom of the page, a number so large it seemed impossible for a piece of land this rocky and wind-scoured to be worth that much to the county. $47.60. Due before the 1st of January 1879. Louise folded the notice carefully, as if treating it gently might somehow reduce its authority, and she tucked it into the pocket of her wool coat. She stood on the porch and looked out over her land. The grass had gone brown and brittle. The cattle were clustered near the fence line on the southern pasture, where a thin creek still ran. Above everything, the mountains rose in their permanent indifference, their peaks already white with early snow. She had $17 in the tin box beneath her bed. She had no one to ask for help, not really. Her nearest neighbor was a rancher named Doyle Hatch who ran cattle 3 miles east, and he had made it quietly known through the summer that he would be happy to buy her land at a fair price, which was his definition of fair and not hers. She had a cousin in Billings who had her own troubles. There was the general store owner in the town of Garnet Creek, a man named Percival Sims, who extended credit but charged interest that could ruin a person faster than no credit at all. What she had was the land and the cattle in her own 2 hands, and she intended to keep all 3. The man she did not know yet, the man who would change everything about the mathematics of her winter, lived 11 miles up the canyon in a cabin that most people in Garnet Creek forgot about for half the year. His name was Marshall Mercer, and he was 32 years old, and he had been trapping and hunting in the mountains above the Yellowstone country for the better part of a decade, since he had come west from Ohio with a young man's hunger for open spaces and a healthy distrust of rooms with more than 4 walls. Marshall was not the kind of man who sought out company, but he was not unfriendly either. He came down to Garnet Creek 3 or 4 times a year, usually when his supply of coffee or lamp oil ran low, and he traded pelts with a man named August Reeves who ran the trading post on the main street. He was known in town as a reliable and honest man, a skilled trapper, and someone who did not cause trouble or drink himself foolish at the saloon. He was tall, with dark hair that he kept longer than was fashionable, a jaw that looked carved from the same granite that made up the mountains he called home, and eyes the color of river water in shadow, neither quite green nor quite gray. He had heard of Clarence Boone's death the way news traveled in the territory, slowly and by word of mouth, arriving distorted and incomplete. He had heard a daughter was keeping the place. He had not thought much about it beyond the vague human acknowledgement that it was a hard situation. Louise first encountered Marshall Mercer on a Tuesday in early October, which she remembered specifically, because Tuesdays were the days she drove the wagon into Garnet Creek for supplies, and she was already running late because one of her cattle had gotten through a gap in the fence, and she had spent an hour and a half catching the animal and repairing the brake. She was coming out of Percival Sims's store with a 50-pound sack of flour balanced against her hip when the sack caught on the door frame and tore, and she watched in pure silent horror as flour cascaded down the front steps in a white waterfall. She stood for a moment just looking at it. The flour she could not really afford to lose, the sack she could not replace today. Here, she looked up. A tall man was crouching down on the steps beside her, cupping flour back into what remained of the sack, and she registered in the same instant that the attempt was essentially futile and that he was making it anyway. He had a battered felt hat and wore a canvas coat with the collar turned up against the wind. "That sack is not going to hold," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "No," he agreed. He looked up at her and she saw those gray-green eyes and the particular quality of stillness in his face that she would later come to understand was simply how he was made, that it was not coldness but rather a kind of patience the mountains had built into him. "Have you got something else to put it in?" She did not. She stared at the flour for another moment and then she straightened up and said, "I am Louise Boone, the Boone Homestead 8 miles west." He stood up, brushing flour off his hands. "Marshall Mercer, I have a cabin up the canyon." He paused. "I have a feed sack in the back of my wagon. You can have it." She wanted to say she did not need his charity, but the flour was still on the steps and it seemed like a poor moment for pride. "I will pay you for it." "It is a feed sack," he said simply. He brought the sack, a rough burlap thing that smelled faintly of oats, and between the two of them they transferred what flour had not been lost into it. The whole transaction took perhaps 10 minutes and involved very little conversation beyond the practical. She thanked him. He nodded once, retrieved his own supplies from the trading post, climbed back onto his wagon, and drove north toward the canyon road. Louise watched him go and then loaded her own wagon and drove home. She thought about him twice in the following days, both times while doing tasks with her hands that did not require her full attention. She thought about the directness of him, the complete absence of performance, the way he had simply solved the problem in front of him without making a production of it. She did not think about him in a romantic way exactly. She was too busy for that, and besides she barely knew his name. But she filed him somewhere in the back of her mind as a person she had found genuine. October grew colder. Louise spent most of her daylight hours working to prepare for winter, mending the barn, stacking hay, checking the cattle, patching the roof of the house where she had found 2 places the summer rains had been getting through. She did the work of the homestead with a grim determination that she did not allow herself to examine too closely, because if she examined it she might start asking herself whether it was sustainable, whether one woman alone could truly maintain this place through a Montana winter, and she was not ready to answer that question. The tax notice stayed in her coat pocket. She took it out sometimes and looked at it the way a person looks at an injury they cannot quite believe they have sustained. She tried everything she could think of. She sold 2 of her cattle, which hurt, and got $19 for them from a rancher in the next valley who drove a harder bargain than she had hoped. That gave her $36, still 11 short. She tried to sell some of her father's tools and equipment, but found there was very little market for second-hand tools in October, when everyone was already preparing for winter, rather than planning new projects. She thought about borrowing from Percival Sims, and the thought made her stomach clench because his interest rate was 15%, and she had no idea how she would repay principal and interest both come spring. She did not think, at that moment, about Marshall Mercer. Marshall, meanwhile, was deep in his work. The autumn trapping season in the mountains above Garnet Creek was the most important time of his year. He ran a line of traps through the high country, checking them every 2 days, working his way through the timber, and along the creek drainages where beaver and otter and fox concentrated in the cold months. The pelts from a good autumn and winter season were what kept him supplied and independent through the rest of the year. A very good season could leave him with enough surplus to set aside against lean years. He was, by the standards of the 1878 Montana Territory, comfortable enough. He heard about the tax situation at Boone Homestead from August Reeves at the trading post, who had heard it from someone at the bank, who had heard it from the county clerk. The way August told it, making conversation while he tallied Marshall's supply list, was that the widow Boone was going to lose her land before January unless something turned her way. "She is not a widow," Marshall said. August blinked. Pardon? Clarence Boone's daughter. She was never married from what I know, not a widow. He was quiet for a moment. How much does she owe? August named the figure with the casual cruelty of someone reporting news rather than someone who understood what the number meant to the person it concerned. Marshall was quiet for longer this time. He picked up his bag of supplies and went out to his wagon. He drove part of the way up the canyon road before he pulled the mules to a stop and sat thinking in the cold afternoon air. He was trying to be honest with himself about why he was sitting here thinking about it instead of simply going home. He had met Louise Boone once for 10 minutes while retrieving flour from a broken sack. That was the sum total of their acquaintance. But she had looked at the flour on those steps with the particular kind of fortitude he recognized, because he had practiced it himself, the kind that means a person is refusing to be defeated by something even while they are standing directly inside it. And she had said her name, and where she lived like they were facts she was proud of, and intended to continue being proud of. He drove home. He thought about it for a week, during which he checked his trap lines and cured the pelts that were coming in, and tried to talk himself out of what he was already planning to do. The argument against was practical. He was not a wealthy man. The pelts from this season were what he had counted on to restock his own supplies, repair equipment, cover the modest fees for his own trapping permits. To give away a significant portion of this season's work would leave him thin through the spring. The argument against was also social. He did not know this woman. She had not asked for his help. She might not want it. She might be offended by it. She might have found another solution he was not aware of. The argument for was quieter and harder to articulate. He had seen her face. He had watched her pick up a flour sack on a cold October morning and refused to let a small catastrophe become a larger defeat. He knew, with the particular knowledge of a person who had lived alone in hard country for many years, what it meant to be facing a thing like this with no one beside you. And there was something else he had trouble naming, something that had arrived in him while they were kneeling on that step together transferring flour into burlap, something that felt like recognition, as if some part of him had noted her in a way that had nothing to do with charity. He kept working. The season deepened. By late November he had a significant collection of cured pelts, beaver and otter and mink and fox, and a few very fine marten skins that would command good prices. He looked at them laid out in his cabin, and he made his decision. In the first week of December, on a day cold enough that his breath preceded him down the canyon road in white clouds, Marshall Mercer drove his wagon into Garnet Creek with most of a season's worth of pelts stacked in the bed. He went to August Reeves at the trading post. August looked at the pelts and looked at Marshall and looked at the pelts again, and named a total price that was fair and slightly generous because August Reeves was not a bad man. "I want to apply the payment directly," Marshall said. He had thought about how to do this with great care. To the tax account at the county clerk's office, for the Boone Homestead, property taxes before the January deadline. August stared at him. "I need $47.60 to go there," Marshall said. "Whatever remains you can credit to my account for supplies." "Marshall," August said. "I know what I am doing," Marshall said. August was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Does she know?" "No," Marshall said, "and I would prefer she not." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "She is a proud woman running her land alone. If she knows it was charity, she will not be able to accept it in the right spirit." "It is not charity exactly," August said slowly. "It needs to be done without her knowing," Marshall said. "Can you see to it that the county clerk marks the account as paid through a general settlement? There must be a way to record it without my name being the first thing she sees when she goes to inquire." August studied him with the patient intelligence of a man who had spent decades watching human nature walk through his door. "I can see that it gets paid," he said. "But Marshall, she will ask questions." "By spring," Marshall said, "it will be paid and she will have kept her land and the questions can sort themselves out." He left with a credit on his account that was considerably smaller than he had planned and drove back up the canyon road. He did not sleep well that night, but it was not regret that kept him awake. Louise spent the first 2 weeks of December in a state of low, constant anxiety that expressed itself as extraordinary industriousness. She patched things that did not need patching. She reorganized the root cellar 3 times. She repaired the handle on a tool that was perfectly functional. She was afraid to look at her finances directly, so she was looking at everything else with great intensity. She made one more attempt to raise money, writing a careful letter to her cousin in Billings explaining the situation. The letter came back 2 weeks later with a note that said the cousin was sorry, but her own circumstances were difficult. Louise read the letter standing in the cold at the mailbox post and then folded it and used it to start the fire that evening. On the 15th of December, she drove to Garnet Creek, intending to go to Percival Sims and arrange the loan she had been dreading. She told herself all the way there that interest could be managed, that she could pay it down through spring sales, that keeping the land was worth any reasonable short-term debt. She went to the county clerk's office first, partly to confirm the exact amount she needed and partly because she was not yet ready to walk into Sims's store and make herself dependent on his charity disguised as commerce. The county clerk was a thin man named Harold Beale who wore wire-rimmed spectacles and kept meticulous records. "I need to know the exact outstanding amount on the property tax for the Boone Homestead," Louise said. "Lot 14, the West Valley parcels." Harold Beale went to his ledgers. He ran his finger down a column and looked up. "That account is settled," he said. Louise stared at him. "I beg your pardon. Settled, paid in full." Harold pushed his spectacles up his nose. "Came through about 10 days ago. A settlement payment, $47.60. The silence in the clerk's office was very complete. Louise could hear the wind outside and the distant sound of someone hammering at the smithy down the street. "Who paid it?" she said. Harold looked at his ledger again. "It came through the Trading Post. August Reeves arranged the transfer." He paused. "I believe it was recorded as a settlement from a general fur trading account." "Whose account?" she said. Harold Beale was not an unkind man, but he was an administrator, and his instinct was for the record rather than the story behind it. "I don't have a specific name on my ledger," he said, which was perhaps not entirely the complete truth. Louise stood in the clerk's office for another minute. Then she said, "Thank you," very quietly and walked out. She went directly to the Trading Post. August Reeves was behind his counter when she walked in, and something in his expression shifted very slightly when he saw her. A small tightening that could have been guilt or could have been the particular discomfort of a man who has been keeping something and has expected the moment of reckoning. "My tax account has been paid," Louise said, without preamble. "Good news," August said. "Who paid it?" August busied himself with something on the shelf behind him. "A settlement was arranged." "August." Her voice was level, but there was something underneath the levelness that was not. "My tax account was $47.60. That is not a small sum. Someone paid it. I want to know who." August was quiet for a very long time. Then he turned back to face her, and there was something apologetic in his face. "It was requested that the source remain private," he said. "I do not care what was requested," Louise said. "It is my land and my debt, and someone has settled it without my knowledge or consent, and I have a right to know who." August set down whatever he was holding. He looked at her with the assessment of a man who has been asked to choose between 2 forms of loyalty. "Marshall Mercer," he said. Louise opened her mouth and closed it again. "He brought in most of his season's pelts," August said, and his voice had gotten quieter, not secretive but careful. "The way people speak about things they understand are larger than the words available. Traded them in. Asked me to apply the payment directly to your account at the clerk's office. He wanted it done without a fuss." Louise stood in the Trading Post doorway with the December wind coming in around her and the smell of leather and oil and dried goods filling the air, and she did not speak for a very long time. "His whole season," she said finally. "Most of it," August said. She walked out. She drove 8 miles home through the cold with her hands on the reins and her mind absolutely unable to form a complete thought. She kept starting sentences in her head and losing them. She tried to feel angry and found she could not quite get there. She tried to feel grateful and found the word too small for what had been done. She tried to feel anything simple and discovered that what had happened was not simple at all. Marshall Mercer had spent months in the mountains doing the hardest and most physical kind of work available to a person in the Montana Territory in 1878. He had traded away the result of that work to pay a debt that was not his, for a woman he did not know, without asking for anything in return, without even allowing his name to be attached to it. She could not find words for that. There were no words that covered the precise shape of what he had done. She fed the cattle in the last gray light of the afternoon and went inside and sat at the kitchen table and stayed there for a long time. She was not a woman who was easily undone. She had buried her father in frozen ground in March, alone except for the minister from Garnet Creek who had ridden out in the cold to say words over the grave. She had managed the homestead through spring and summer and fall without complaint or self-pity, or at least with very little of either. She was, as a matter of character, capable and self-contained. But this undid her somewhat, not the debt being paid, though that was large. It was the quality of the act, the fact that he had done it invisibly, without the performance of generosity, without requiring her gratitude or her acknowledgement. The fact that someone she barely knew had looked at her situation from 11 miles away and decided, simply and privately, that he would not let her lose what she had worked to keep. Winter settled over the territory. Snow came down from the Upsarokas in earnest, first soft and then hard, until the valley was white and the roads were difficult, and the world contracted to the immediate radius of warmth and survival. Louise worked through it steadily, caring for her remaining cattle, keeping the pipes from freezing, cutting wood, cooking, mending, all the 1,000 daily acts that kept a homestead alive. She thought about Marshall Mercer more than she expected to. She thought about going up the canyon to find him, to say something, to do something that matched the weight of what he had done. But the road was difficult in winter, and she did not know him well enough to simply arrive at his door, and besides she still could not find the words. The words kept falling short, the way the flour had fallen through the torn sack, impossible to retrieve and put back into a useful shape. She thought instead about what kind of man does a thing like that. She thought about the stillness she had seen in him on the porch steps of Sims's store, that patience that was not coldness. She thought about the way he had simply started cupping flour back into a torn sack even though the effort was hopeless, because the alternative was to stand there and do nothing, and that was not how he was made. She thought about his eyes. She was embarrassed to find herself thinking about his eyes. January was brutal. February was worse. Louise got through both of them by the same method she had gotten through everything else, which was to concentrate very hard on the thing directly in front of her and not allow herself to look too far ahead. She named the problem currently before her, and she addressed it, and she moved to the next one. She did not hear from Marshall Mercer. She did not expect to. She did not know if he knew that she knew, and the uncertainty of that made every imagined encounter complicated in ways she could not resolve while sitting alone in a snow-covered homestead in February. The cattle survived the winter, all 12 of the remaining ones, which was more than she had hoped for. The barn held. The house held. The pipes froze twice, and she dealt with both occasions with a combination of hot water and profanity she would not have admitted to in company. She started a kitchen garden inside in late February, planting seeds in small clay pots on the windowsills, because the sight of green things growing was necessary for her sanity. She watched the sprouts push up through the soil with a tenderness she found slightly embarrassing. Growing things felt like an answer to something, even if she could not name the question. March arrived with a thaw so slow, and grudging it barely deserved the name. The snow began to withdraw from the lower elevations, pulling back up the slopes like a reluctant tide. The creek ran high and fast with melt. The cattle moved out into the pasture with the obvious relief of animals who have been patient for a very long time. Louise felt spring arriving in her bones before she could see it in the land. There was a loosening somewhere in her chest, a slight release of the sustained vigilance that winter required. She had made it. The homestead was intact. The land was hers. In the second week of March, she drove to Garnet Creek. She did not go there for supplies, or not primarily. She went because she had been carrying a weight since December, a debt that had nothing to do with money and that she had not been able to set down. She needed to find Marshall Mercer. But first she went to the trading post, because she wanted to understand the full shape of what he had done before she faced him. August Reeves was more forthcoming this time, perhaps because the winter had passed and the secrecy had served its purpose, or perhaps because he could see in Louise's face that she was going to understand the whole thing whether he helped her or not. "How many pelts?" she asked. August told her. "And what would that be worth to him?" she said. "For his year's supplies and equipment." August was quiet for a moment. "It would mean a lean spring," he said carefully. "He would have enough for basics. But he would have started this season without the buffer a good winter haul usually gives him." He paused. He had been having a couple of strong seasons. He would have set himself back a ways. Louise absorbed this with a stillness that matched, had she known it, the stillness she had first noticed in Marshall himself. "Is he in town?" she asked. "Came in yesterday morning," August said. "I believe he took a room at the boarding house. He usually does when the canyon road gets muddy in spring. Easier to wait for the ground to firm up." Louise thanked him and went out. The boarding house was run by a woman named Edna Carruthers, who was brisk and practical, and whose establishment was scrupulously clean. Louise had stayed there twice herself, once when a snowstorm had caught her in town, and once when the road had been impassable for a different reason. She knew Edna to be the kind of woman who noticed everything and said only what was useful. She knocked on the front door and Edna answered and looked at her with the particular expression of a woman who has a good guess about the errand. "Is Marshall Mercer staying here?" Louise said. "He is," Edna said. "Out back, I think. He does not sit still well indoors." Louise went around the side of the building to the small yard behind the boarding house, where a woodpile stood against the back fence, and a few chickens moved around in the thawed mud. Marshall was there, splitting wood with the efficient, concentrated effort of a man for whom physical work was a form of thought. He was in his canvas coat with the collar down in deference to the March thaw, and he had his back to her. He heard her footsteps and turned. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved across his face that he controlled before she could read it entirely, but not quite before she caught the edge of it, and she saw that he was not entirely surprised, which meant he knew that she knew. They looked at each other across the muddy yard, with the chickens moving between them and the sound of water running somewhere nearby, and the mountains in the distance, still white above the brown tree line. Louise had been preparing for this moment since December. She had prepared words, sensible and gracious words that would acknowledge what he had done and express her genuine gratitude and still maintain the dignity of a woman who had not asked to be rescued. She had those words ready. She opened her mouth and they all left her. She stood there in silence for a long, difficult moment. "You traded your winter pelts," she said. It was not what she had planned. It was the plain fact of the thing, and it came out stripped of all the careful framing she had built around it. "I heard you were in a difficult situation," he said. His voice was level. "You traded your winter pelts," she said again, as if saying it twice might help her understand it. "For land you have never stood on, for someone you had met once for 10 minutes. He set the axe down, handle first, against the wood block. He looked at her steadily. "I had a good season," he said. "August told me what a good season means to you," she said. "He told me what it meant for your spring." Marshall was quiet. "I do not understand it," Louise said. Her voice was honest about this. She was not performing bewilderment. She was genuinely bewildered, had been bewildered since December, and looking at him now she was still bewildered, and the bewilderment had a warmth inside it that frightened her a little. "I need you to explain it to me." He looked at her for a long time before he answered, and when he answered his voice was not evasive but it was careful, the care of a man who does not use more words than he needs. "I saw you on those steps in October," he said. "With the flower." He paused. "I have been in this country a long time, Louise. I know what it costs a person to hold a place together alone. I know what it looks like when someone is refusing to be broken by something." He stopped again. "You were not going to ask for help. You would have lost your land before you asked, and that seemed to me like a waste of something worth keeping." The yard was very quiet. A chicken made a small sound and walked somewhere else. "I am not a charity case," Louise said. She said it without heat. It was a statement of who she was. "No," he agreed. "You are not." "Then why?" she said. He picked the axe up and held it loosely at his side and looked at her, and whatever was in his face was the most direct and unguarded thing she had seen since she had walked into this yard. "Because I wanted to," he said. Something shifted in Louise's chest, something that had been held under tension for months, and she felt it release with an almost physical sensation. She looked at him standing there with the axe and the mud and the chickens and the remaining snow on the distant mountains, and she thought about all the things she had meant to say, the careful, grateful, measured words, and found she had nothing left that was adequate. "Thank you," she said. The words were plain and small and did not cover it. She knew they did not cover it. He knew it too. "You kept your land," he said. "That is the part that matters." "I did not keep my land," she said. "You kept my land." He looked slightly uncomfortable with this, which she thought was interesting. He had done an enormously generous thing, and the credit for it made him shift his weight like a man who finds direct praise as difficult as direct criticism. "Come to supper," she said before she had entirely thought it through. He looked at her. "At the homestead," she said. "When the road dries, come to supper." She held his gaze. "I cannot repay what you did, I know that, but I can cook a meal, and I think you deserve a meal at the very least, and I want you to come." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right." She drove home through the March mud with her heart doing something unfamiliar and not unpleasant, and she thought about that for the whole 8 miles. The road dried in the second week of April, which was when spring truly arrived in the valley. Arriving all at once after weeks of tentative approach the way, a decision arrives after a long, uncertain period, suddenly definite and everywhere. The cottonwoods along the creek put out their first pale green. The meadow that had been brown and flat became faintly, impossibly luminous with the new grass coming through. Louise's garden pots on the windowsills were now full of plants that needed to go outside, tomatoes and squash, and the herbs she grew because they made the kitchen smell like something other than wood smoke. She cooked for 2 days before Marshall Mercer arrived. She made a pot roast with the root vegetables that had survived in the cellar, and biscuits, and an apple pie from the dried apples she had put up in fall. She was aware that she was cooking with more care than the occasion strictly required, and she was also aware that she did not intend to stop. He arrived in the late afternoon on a Wednesday, riding a blue roan horse rather than driving the wagon, which suggested the visit was a personal one rather than a working one. He came up the lane slowly, and she watched him from the window before she went outside, watching the way he sat the horse and the way his eyes moved across her land, taking it in with the attentive practical gaze of a man who reads landscape habitually. She went out to meet him. "Your fence line is good," he said, by way of greeting, which she had not expected, and which somehow made her feel better about things than any more conventional opening would have. "I spent most of October working on it," she said. He swung down from the horse, and she showed him where to tie it at the water trough, and then they went inside. The kitchen was warm from the cooking, and smelled the way a kitchen is supposed to smell, like bread and roasting meat, and something slightly sweet. Marshall Mercer stood in the doorway for a moment and looked around the room with the expression of a man who has not been inside a proper home for a long time, and Louise saw something in his face that she could not name but recognized as a kind of hunger that was not about food. "Sit down," she said, and she meant it as an invitation rather than a command, though she suspected it came out sounding slightly like a command. He sat at the table. They ate. At first the conversation was practical and slightly careful. The way conversation is between two people who are testing the depth of the water before deciding how far to wade in. He asked about the cattle, and she told him about the winter losses she had been spared, all 12 surviving, and he said that was exceptional for a hard winter, and she felt a proprietary pride about the cattle that made her sound, when she talked about them, almost fond of the animals. She asked him about the mountains, about what it was like to live up in the canyon through the deep cold, and he answered with more words than she had expected, because the mountains were the subject he knew best, and on that subject he became, not exactly talkative but willing to speak at length. He told her about the silence of high country in January, a silence so complete it had a texture to it, like something you could push against. He told her about the animals he watched, not just the ones he trapped but all of them, the elk herds moving through the timber, the mountain lions he saw rarely but often enough to know they were there, the wolves that had been coming back into this part of the territory in the last few years. "Do you not get lonely?" she asked. She meant it sincerely, not as a provocation. He considered the question seriously, which was how she was coming to understand he considered every question. "Sometimes," he said. "In February, usually. The dark gets long and the days repeat." He paused. "But lonely is different from alone. I do not mind alone. It is only sometimes that alone becomes lonely." She understood that distinction perfectly and told him so, and something shifted in the quality of his attention when she said it, a focus that had not been quite so precise before, as if a lens had been adjusted slightly. They stayed at the table for a long time after the meal was done, talking in the lamplight while the spring night cooled outside, and Louise found that the words that had been absent in December were coming back in a different form. Not the formal, grateful words she had planned, but the ordinary words of two people discovering each other, which were in the end much more useful. He helped her clear the table, which she had not expected, and he did it without making it an issue, just simply stood up and carried plates to the washing tub with the same matter-of-fact practicality he seemed to apply to everything. "You do not have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. She washed the dishes and he dried them, and she thought about how strange it was to have another person in the kitchen, after so many months of only herself in this space, and how it was strange but not uncomfortable. The opposite of uncomfortable. Something that felt like its own kind of answer. He left when the night was properly dark, riding back up the canyon road by moonlight, which she worried about slightly, but he dismissed with a look that reminded her he had been navigating these mountains in all conditions for 10 years. She stood on the porch and watched his lantern disappear up the canyon road and stayed there for a while after the light was gone. He came back the following Sunday. She had not specifically invited him for Sunday, and he had not specifically asked to come on Sunday, but he arrived in the early afternoon with a coil of rope. He said he had found extra at his cabin that she might be able to use for the cattle, and he stayed for most of the day. They walked the fence line together, and he pointed out 2 places where the posts were shifting and would need resetting before summer, which she had not noticed herself and was glad to know about. They walked down to the creek, and she showed him where the bank had eroded over the winter in one place, and he thought for a while, and suggested a method for reinforcing it with willow stakes that he said he had seen used effectively on similar ground. She listened to him talk about the land with the attention she gave to things that mattered. He knew land the way she knew cattle, from the inside, from long, close observation. He did not talk about it in the romantic way that some people talked about the West, as scenery or symbol. He talked about it as a working system, as a set of relationships between soil and water and plant and animal that could be read if you were patient enough. She told him about her father's plans for the homestead, the plans that had not been finished when Clarence died, the places where ambition had outrun execution, the barn that was half built, the irrigation channel he had meant to cut from the North Fork of the creek. She told him these things matter-of-factly, but he heard something underneath them and said, quietly, You intend to finish them?" "Yes," she said. "The barn first," he said. "The barn first," she agreed. He came back the following Sunday and the Sunday after that. The visits were not romantic in any declared way. They never spoke of anything that named what was happening, but the shape of what was happening was clear enough to both of them, the way the shape of a landscape is clear before you have words for the specific features. He was there and she wanted him there, and she could see in the particular way he moved through her land that he had begun to think of it as something that mattered to him, not abstractly but specifically. This fence line and this creek and this south-facing meadow where the grass came in thicker than anywhere else. In the 4th week of April he came on a Wednesday instead of a Sunday, and she understood from this that the formality of the Sunday visit was dissolving into something less structured, and she was glad of it. He came carrying a good quantity of lumber in his wagon, cedar planking, good dry wood, more than she could have afforded. "The barn," he said. She stood on her porch and looked at the lumber and looked at him. "Marshall," she said. "I still have hands," he said, "and it is a dry week." He looked at her steadily. "Let me help you with the barn," she thought for a moment. She thought about pride and about the nature of what was developing between them, which was not a relation of debtor and benefactor but something considerably more equal than that, and she decided that accepting his help with the barn was not the same as accepting charity, because the situation between them was no longer the situation of October and December. It had become something else. "I can cook every meal you are here," she said. "That seems fair," he said. They spent 5 days working on the barn. He was skilled with wood in the practical way of a man who has built and repaired everything in his own life. No craftsman's precision but solid and workmanlike, and better than she could have done alone. She worked alongside him, handing lumber and holding sections while he set them, learning the technique as they went. They worked in comfortable silence for long stretches and talked in bursts, and she found that the quality of their silence together was excellent, which was a test she applied to people unconsciously, and that very few passed. On the 3rd evening of barn work, sitting on the tailgate of his wagon eating the supper she had brought out to them rather than go inside, because neither of them had wanted to stop, Marshall said, "I have been thinking about staying in the valley longer this spring." Louise was quiet for a moment. "The canyon road is clear now," she said. "It is," he said. They looked at the half-completed barn in the early evening light. "Garnet Creek has a boarding house," she said. He looked at her sideways with something that was almost humor. "It does," he said. "That seems inconvenient," she said, "when there is work to be done here." He was quiet. "There is a room," she said carefully. "A small one off the back of the house. My father used it for the hired man he kept for 2 summers. It is plain, but it is dry." The silence that followed this was not awkward, but it was charged. "That would be appropriate only if," Marshall said and stopped. "Only if things between us are clearly understood," she finished. "Yes," he said. She turned on the wagon tailgate to look at him directly, which was not something she always did. She was not shy, but she was private, and looking at someone directly this way was a form of statement. "I think things between us are fairly clear," she said, "though I would find it helpful if you said something more specific." He looked at her with those gray-green eyes and the evening light catching the left side of his face, and he said, with the directness she had come to expect from him and which she valued beyond almost everything else, "I am in love with you. That has been clear to me for some time. I did not say it because I did not want you to confuse it with the other thing, the tax matter. I did not want you to think the one was in service of the other." Louise was quiet for a long moment. She looked at her hands. She looked at the barn, she looked at the mountains. "I was confused about that," she said honestly, "for a while." "I know," he said. "I am not confused about it now," she said. He waited. "I think I have been in love with you since February," she said, "which was inconvenient because I had not yet spoken to you since December and I was not at all certain you would ever come back, and loving someone who may not return seemed like a very poor investment of feeling." Something happened in his face then, something warm and not quite contained. I was always going to come back, he said. I did not know that, she said. I know, he said again. I should have made it clearer. I am not always good at making things clear. You are remarkably clear most of the time, she said. Not about this, he said. Not about things that matter to me this much. She leaned slightly toward him on the wagon tailgate, and he met her partway, and when he kissed her, it was with the same quality she had come to know in all his other actions, thorough and deliberate and not hurried, as if he had all the time in the territory for this and intended to use it. The barn was completed by the end of the week. He did stay in the valley, and he did take the small room off the back of the house, and the arrangement was what it was supposed to be, which was to say proper and uncomplicated, two adults who understood their own minds and were taking their time about the form of their future. He divided his time between the homestead and trips back up the canyon to check on his cabin and continue his spring trapping, which was lighter work than the winter season but still necessary. The valley was beautiful in spring, which Louise had known but which she found herself seeing differently, through his eyes and through the new lightness in herself. The meadow grass was fully green now, a deep, rich color that the winter seemed to have contributed to, as if the cold had been a form of preparation. The cottonwoods along the creek were in full leaf. The cattle were sleek and the calves were coming along well. She showed Marshall the 4 calves that had been born in April, 2 of them strong and one a little uncertain on its feet but improving daily. He bent down and assessed the uncertain one with the same focused attention he gave everything, and said the calf was fine, just a little small at birth and making up the deficit, and she was relieved by the confidence in his assessment. She showed him her kitchen garden, which she had transplanted outside now, the tomatoes and squash and herbs in the plot her father had made against the south wall of the house, where the soil was richest. He crouched down and looked at the plants and said the tomatoes were growing well. My father always said a homestead without a garden was only half a homestead, she said. Your father sounds like a man who was right about things, Marshall said. He was right about most things, she said. He was not right about the debts he kept quiet about. Marshall looked up at her. He probably thought he would have time to handle them himself. Yes, she said. She was quiet for a moment. I do not blame him, I miss him. Those are separate things. They usually are, Marshall said. On a warm evening in late April they were sitting on the porch after supper, which had become one of the constants of the days they were together, this sitting in the fading light with the whole valley spread out before them going golden in the dusk. The cattle were quiet in the pasture. The creek made its sound in the distance. I want to ask you something, Louise said. Ask, he said. Do you miss the mountains, living here in the valley? He was quiet for a while, which was his way with questions that deserved real consideration. I miss certain things, he said. The high country in clear, cold air, the particular quiet, the elk at dawn. He looked out at the valley. But I find I do not miss it the way I expected to. I thought I would feel enclosed down here. I do not. Why not? She said. Because of the specific view from this particular porch, he said, and glanced at her once with a slight directness that made her laugh, which she did not do easily and which he looked pleased to have caused. The question of the future came up organically in May, not as a dramatic declaration, but as a practical conversation that grew naturally out of the weeks that had preceded it. They were discussing the irrigation channel her father had planned, the one that would bring water from the north fork of the creek to the lower pasture, where the grass was thinnest in dry summers, and Marshall was sketching the route with a stick in the dirt, and she was pointing out a place where the ground was too hard for easy digging, and somewhere in the middle of this conversation it became clear to both of them that they were talking about years. Not about this summer's work or even this year's. About years. About the shape of this place across years. I should tell you, Marshall said and stopped. Louise waited. I have no great wealth, he said. I have my trade and my skills and the modest savings of a man who has lived carefully. I have my cabin and my equipment. I'm not a man who can offer you security in the conventional sense. He looked at her. I want you to know that clearly before I ask you anything. "Marshall," she said, "I want to be honest with you about it," he said. "You are the man who gave away most of a season's income for my benefit without telling me," she said. "I do not think wealth is the relevant measure here." He smiled slightly, which was still something she found exceptional because it was not common, and each instance felt like a small discovery. "Marry me," he said. Not a question in form, but a question in every other sense, offered without pressure, simply placed before her the way he placed everything, honestly and without decoration. She looked at him in the spring afternoon, in her own land that was still hers because of what he had done, with her cattle in the pasture and her garden against the south wall, and the mountains behind him that he had lived in and loved and was willing to leave for this valley and for her, and she thought about loneliness and about what its opposite was. "Yes," she said, without hesitation. The wedding was in June, performed by the minister from Garnet Creek, who rode out on a fine clear day when the valley was at its most extravagant with wildflowers, the yellow and purple and white of them in the meadow grass looking excessive and wonderful. There were not many guests because they did not have many people to invite, but the people who came were good ones. August Reeves was there, which felt appropriate. Edna Carruthers from the boarding house came with a fruit cake that was better than the occasion required. Doyle Hatch, the rancher to the east who had wanted to buy the land, came and shook Marshall's hand and said something to Louise that sounded like genuine congratulation, and she thought that perhaps knowing the land was now firmly secured changed his calculations in a way that released whatever tension there had been. The ceremony was short and practical, and the vows they spoke were the traditional ones, but Louise heard them differently than she had imagined she would, hearing the specific weight of each word against the specific history of the people speaking them. When the minister pronounced them married and Marshall held her face in his hands and kissed her, she felt the last of the winter come off her the way ice comes off the creek in true spring, all at once and completely. The summer was the best she could remember, which was in part because it genuinely was a good summer, warm and not excessively dry, the grass rich and the cattle healthy and the garden producing beyond her expectations. But it was also because the company changed everything. She had not known how much she had been living at partial capacity, keeping herself at a level of restraint and containment that was necessary for a single person maintaining a homestead alone, until she no longer had to. Marshall learned the cattle and the cattle learned him, which took time on both sides. He was not a cattleman by training and she was, or had become one, and there were moments where she showed him things and moments where he showed her things, and the balance of knowledge and experience between them was more interesting than either of them had anticipated. He began to reshape his trapping operation, making it work with the demands of the homestead rather than against them. He kept his canyon cabin, which he visited during the deepest part of the trapping season, but the center of his year shifted to the valley. The homestead was his home now in a way his cabin had never quite been, and she thought this was not because of the building, but because of who was in it. They built the irrigation channel her father had designed, the two of them and an intermittently hired hand named Tobias, who was 16 and extremely strong and extremely willing, but who needed close supervision to work in a straight line. The channel took most of the summer and it was finished in late August, and the first time water ran along it from the North Fork to the lower pasture, they both stood and watched it in silence for a while, and she thought about her father and what he would have made of all of this, and she thought he would have been satisfied. In the fall of 1879, with the first anniversary of their acquaintance approaching, Louise discovered she was pregnant. She was not surprised, not truly, and she was not frightened, not exactly, though the information carried its own weight of both wonder and apprehension in the way that such information always does. She told Marshall on a September evening on the porch at the same time of day, and in the same way that the most important things between them seemed to happen, quietly and without ceremony. He was very still for a moment, stiller even than usual, and she watched his face carefully. Then he reached over and took her hand, which was something he did, holding her hand without making it a production, and he said, "Are you well?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "Good," he said. And then after a moment, "Good." She laughed at him, not unkindly, for the extreme compression of his reaction, and he looked at her with the slight warmth that lived in his face when she laughed. And then the warmth became something larger and less contained, and he pulled her toward him and held her, and she felt, against his shoulder, that his heart was moving fast. The baby was born in May of 1880, a boy, a strong-lunged and emphatic presence who arrived after a long labor that made Louise discover new reservoirs of stubbornness she had not previously known she possessed. Marshall was present for all of it, which was not the universal practice of men in the territory, but was absolutely in keeping with who he was. He held her hand through the difficult hours with the focused, uncomplaining attention of a man who considers that it is exactly where he should be. The baby was named Clarence, for her father, which she had decided on without consultation, but which Marshall approved immediately and without reservation. Young Clarence was, from the first days of his life, an interested observer of everything. He lay in his cradle and watched the light move across the ceiling with the focused attention of someone cataloging phenomena. He watched his father's face and his mother's face with equal concentration. He made sounds that seemed, from very early, to be attempts at communication rather than simple expression. Louise nursed him in the big chair by the window and looked out at her land, the land that was still hers, the land she had held through the winter, and she thought about all the strange and improbable sequence of events that had led to this specific morning, to this baby in her arms and this man in the barn she could hear moving about, and the thin October sun on the south field, and the cattle moving peacefully in the pasture. She thought about December 1878, standing in the county clerk's office hearing Harold Beale tell her the account was settled. She thought about walking into the trading post and pressing August Reeves for a name. She thought about driving 8 miles home through the mud with her mind unable to form a complete sentence about what had been done for her. She thought about that yard behind Edna Carruthers' boarding house, the chickens in the mud and the mountains above, and Marshall standing with an axe and looking at her with his most unguarded face, and her own carefully prepared words deserting her entirely, and the truth she had arrived at without words, which was that some things simply could not be said and needed to be understood differently. She looked down at Clarence, who was looking back at her with the dark gray-green eyes that were his father's eyes in his mother's face, or perhaps his mother's eyes in the general shape of his father. It was difficult to say. He made a small, serious sound. "I know," she said to him. Marshall came in from the barn, shrugging off his coat in the doorway, and crossed the room and looked at the baby, and then at her with the same expression that he had had since Clarence arrived. A combination of something like awe and something like certainty, which she thought was perhaps the combination all of the best things were made of. "He is watching the light again," Marshall said. "He does that constantly," she said. "He is trying to understand it," Marshall said. "How do you know?" "Because that is exactly what I would do," he said. She smiled. He sat down in the chair across from her, close enough to reach over and put his hand briefly on the baby's very small fist, which Clarence gripped with the automatic reflexive strength of very young things, and Marshall looked at that for a moment with great seriousness. The homestead grew and changed over the years that followed. They expanded the cattle operation in the second year, adding a small breeding line that Louise managed with her usual methodical competence, learning the genetics and the seasonal rhythms with the same focused intelligence she had applied to every challenge of her life. Marshall's trapping and hunting continued to contribute meaningfully to their income, and his intimate knowledge of the surrounding country made him, gradually, a person that other settlers in the valley came to for information and sometimes for guidance. He guided hunting parties in the autumn for supplemental income, men from eastern cities who came out to the Montana Territory with their ideas about wilderness, and who needed someone patient enough to show them that it was not theater. Marshall was good at this, though he came home from those expeditions with a dryness of manner that she recognized as the residue of long exposure to people who were not entirely real about things. In the spring of 1882, their second child arrived, a girl they named Margaret, and where Clarence had been focused and contemplative from the first days, Margaret was from the beginning a person of strong opinions and immediate reactions, who objected loudly to cold and to hunger, and to any situation she found unsatisfactory, and who had her mother's eyes and her mother's particular brand of uncompromising directness. Louise watched her daughter and recognized herself with both amusement and something more tender. She thought about being 26 and alone on a homestead with a tax notice in her coat pocket and no words left for what was wrong. She thought about how a person gets through things and what helps, and how sometimes the help comes from directions you did not anticipate and cannot plan for. By the fall of 1882, the Boone homestead, now known generally around Garnet Creek as the Mercer place, though Louise still registered it under the family name of Boone as her father had established it, was one of the more successful small operations in the valley. Not large by the standards of the cattle barons who were beginning to consolidate land in the territory in ways that were not always fair or kind to smaller holders, but solid, productive, a place with a future that was clearly visible from where they were standing. Doyle Hatch, who ran his cattle operation to the east and who had never quite given up on eventual expansion, came one autumn day to see about buying the south quarter, the piece that ran along his own fence line. He was polite about it, and his price was generous. Louise listened to him make his offer on her porch with her arms folded and looked at him when he was finished. "No," she said. Hatch looked at her and then at Marshall, who was standing just inside the doorway and who had nothing particular in his face. "It is a fair offer," Hatch said. "It is," Louise agreed. "The answer is still no." Hatch accepted this without rancor. He was not a bad man. He had simply misjudged her in 1878 and had been recalibrating ever since. There was an evening in the late summer of 1883 when Clarence was 3 years old and Margaret was just over a year, and both children were asleep in the house, and the sun was going down over the valley in the way it did at that time of year, enormous and orange and extravagant, that Louise and Marshall were on the porch with their coffee and the world was quiet. "I have been thinking," she said. He waited. "About December 1878, she said. She said it not with any weight of grievance but with the particular lightness of a person revisiting something from a distance that allows for clarity. He looked at her. "You said you wanted it done without my knowing," she said. "Why, at the time, I mean, what were you thinking would happen?" He was quiet for a while, which was the sign that he was answering honestly rather than quickly. "I thought you would lose your land," he said, "which would be wrong, and I thought you would not accept direct help, which was obvious from 5 minutes in your company." He paused. "I thought if the debt was simply paid, you would keep what was yours and work out the rest in your own time." "And if I had never worked it out," she said, "if I had never found out it was you." He looked at the mountains, which were going from brown to gold in the evening light, the aspens on the lower slopes in full October color. "Then you would still have your land," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "You would have been content with that," she said. "It was not quite a question." "I do not know," he said honestly. "I had not let myself think past the immediate problem." He paused. "I think I hoped you would ask. I hoped you would push until you found the answer." "I did push," she said. "You did," he said, "immediately, which I expected and was glad of." "Marshall," she said. He looked at her. "It is still the largest thing anyone has ever done for me," she said. "That will always be true." He reached over and took her hand in the way he did, simply and without announcement. "You would have found another way," he said. "Maybe," she said. "You would have," he said. "You are the most determined person I have ever known. You would have found something." "But I did not have to," she said, "because of you." The sun touched the mountains and the valley went from gold to rose and the cattle in the pasture moved in their slow, tranquil way, and inside the house, one of the children made a small sound and quieted again. "I love you," she said. She said it the way she said everything important, plainly and with her full attention behind it. "I know," he said. He said it not dismissively but with certainty, the certainty of a man who has been shown a thing conclusively and carries the knowledge of it without needing to examine it further. "I love you," he said. "That has never changed." The evening deepened. They sat on the porch of the homestead that was theirs, that had been saved by winter pelts and one man's quiet conviction, watching the light leave the valley while inside the house two small lives breathed in the dark. The following spring brought another excellent trapping season for Marshall and a very good calving year for Louise's cattle. 5 strong calves, including a pair of twins from the best of her cows, which she considered nearly miraculous, and which she announced to Marshall with the pride of someone reporting a significant professional achievement. He was appropriately impressed. He said the twins were a sign of good things, and she said she did not generally believe in signs but would make an exception in this case. That summer they hired a permanent hand, a young man of 20 named Ezra Flood, who came from a family of settlers 2 valleys over, and who was hardworking and good-natured, and who became quickly devoted to the homestead in the particular way of young people who have found a place where they fit. Ezra was respectful of Louise's authority over the cattle operation and learned readily from Marshall everything there was to know about maintaining the buildings and fences and the ongoing work of the land. With Ezra's help, they completed the second significant expansion of the barn, the one that allowed them to keep all their cattle under cover in the worst winter conditions, which improved the survival rates and the overall health of the herd. They also finally managed the second stage of the irrigation system, extending the channel her father had designed to cover the entire lower pasture, which transformed it from marginal to excellent summer grazing. Louise walked the full length of the completed channel on the September morning it first ran from end to end, watching the water move along the course they had cut for it through a full summer's work, and she thought about her father and what he would have made of this place as it was now, 5 years from his death. She thought he would have been proud of the cattle and the land and the barn and the channel. She thought he would have been proud of her. She thought he would have liked Marshall Mercer very much, which was a thought that arrived with such certainty it was almost like a memory. Clarence, at 4, had developed the habit of following his father everywhere that was safe for him to go, and Marshall allowed this with a patience that Louise found moving to watch. He explained things to the boy as they worked, not simplified child versions of explanations, but the actual explanations, spoken at a level that trusted the child to grow into understanding. She had heard Marshall describe the mechanics of a beaver dam to a 4-year-old with the same seriousness he would have brought to discussing it with another adult, and she had watched Clarence listening with his brow furrowed in concentration, and she had thought that these two were very much alike. Margaret was by this time old enough to follow Louise in her work, and had taken a fierce and personal interest in the cattle, particularly the calves, to whom she spoke with great authority in a voice that expected compliance. Louise watched her daughter circle a calf with her hands on her hips and thought, "There I am," which was both amusing and wonderful. One October afternoon in 1884, Marshall came home from a 2-week trip to the canyon cabin for the first of the fall trapping. He came in the late afternoon, and the children ran to him as they always did, Clarence first with his long, serious stride and Margaret right behind making more noise about it, and he crouched down and held both of them in his arms for a moment before he stood up and crossed the porch to where Louise was standing. He looked different than when he had left. Not in any way she could clearly name, but there was a quality in his face of something that had been decided. "How was the cabin?" she said. "Good," he said. "Solid, roof held." He paused. "I was thinking while I was up there." He looked at her. "It is time to let the cabin go." She looked at him carefully. "I can run the fall line from here," he said. "Ride out early, come back in the evening when I can, stay at Garnet Creek when I need to be further out." He looked at the valley. "The canyon is beautiful, but I do not need a separate home up there. I have a home here." She was quiet for a moment. "You are sure," she said. "I have been sure for a long time," he said. "I just needed to go back and be sure in person." He almost smiled. "It is still beautiful, and it is still mine. I can keep it for shelter during the season if I need it, but I am not going back to living there." "All right," she said. "All right," he agreed. Clarence had come back and was pulling at Marshall's hand, saying something about a rabbit he had seen in the pasture that morning that needed to be discussed at length and immediately. Marshall looked down at him, and then at Louise once more with the particular expression she had learned over 5 years to read precisely, the expression that was his version of everything, love and certainty, and the specific pleasure of being exactly where he meant to be. "Go," she said. "Hear about the rabbit." He went, the boy's hand in his, down the porch steps and into the yard, and she watched them, and then she looked out over her land, over the valley and the mountains beyond, and she thought about all the winters it took to make a spring, and about the people you did not know you were waiting for, and about the specific improbable grace of a life that turns out to be more than you thought you were building. She thought about flour on a cold porch step, about a name and an address, and a man who had crouched down to cup the spilled flour back even though it could not be saved. She thought about December, and a tax notice paid in silence with winter pelts, and a spring morning in a boarding house yard, and the words she had not had then, the words she had spent the 5 years since learning to live without needing, because the thing they would have named was already there and understood between them, carved into the daily substance of their lives more permanently than anything words could have made. Margaret came out of the house behind her and took her hand without ceremony, as if this were simply where she intended to stand, next to her mother watching the yard. "Papa is looking at the rabbit," Margaret said. "I know," Louise said. "There is no rabbit," Margaret said. "Clarence is making it up." "Probably," Louise said. "Papa knows," Margaret said with the certainty of someone reporting a confirmed fact. "He always knows." Louise looked down at her daughter, her small, serious face and her absolute conviction about the people she loved, and she thought, yes, he does, and she does, and we all do finally. We know. The valley went gold in the October light, and the cattle moved in the pasture, and at the far end of the yard Marshall was crouching down with Clarence to look at the place where the rabbit was or was not, and his voice came back to her across the distance, low and attentive and present, and the mountains stood in the blue sky above everything, and the homestead was whole.